Okay guys, let's start with the accusation itself, because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. On July 27th, 2026, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi did something diplomats almost never do. He didn't just condemn an attack, he named a hidden author behind it. After a Ukrainian drone strike killed an Iranian sailor on a commercial vessel in the Caspian Sea, Araghchi didn't just call it a violation of the UN charter that could not go unanswered. He said Israel had provoked Ukraine into carrying out the strike specifically to pull Europe deeper into the war. Stop and think about what that claim actually is. It is not Ukraine attacked us. It is Israel used Ukraine as a proxy to trigger a NATO-adjacent country into escalating a war that America is already losing control of. That is a much bigger accusation. And whether or not you believe it, the fact that Iran is making it publicly through its top diplomat on the same day its rival's prime minister is meeting Donald Trump in Washington tells you something about how this war is actually being fought now, not just with bombs, with alliances, with which country can drag which other country into the blast radius. That's what we're unpacking today. Let me give you the context first, for anyone just catching up, because the details matter more than usual here. 5 months ago, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a joint military campaign aimed at destroying Iran's nuclear infrastructure and decapitating its senior leadership. A ceasefire followed in the spring. Then, an interim deal in June was supposed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz for good. But Iran, instead of standing down, tried to assert control over the strait itself, demanding ships follow its approved routes, and according to reporting, firing on multiple commercial vessels in early July. That brought the United States back into active strikes. The war never actually ended. It just changed shape, and it changed who was allowed to say it was still happening. The Pentagon itself has quietly reclassified newer casualties into a separate category, because the administration maintains the original operation concluded back in May, even while American service members have continued to be killed and wounded since. Now it's late July, and what used to be a two-country war, America and Israel against Iran, is starting to look like something else entirely, a war with participants who never signed up to be participants. Let's walk through the sequence of the last few days, because the order of events is the whole story. On the weekend of July 25th and 26th, Ukraine struck 2 vessels in the Caspian Sea, an inland body of water Iran has treated as its own strategic backyard for decades. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said publicly that his forces achieved, in his words, very strong results against vessels used for military cargo shipments involving Iran, plus a warship. Iran identified one of the ships as the Anna, a commercial vessel, and said a 23-year-old sailor named Nima Maradi died from the strike, with several others wounded. Here's where it gets interesting. Zelensky didn't just claim the ships were legitimate military targets. He went further. He said Ukraine had detected active Russian satellite surveillance of Gulf state territory and American bases in the region since the start of July, and that the resulting imagery was showing up in Iranian hands before and after Iranian strikes. In plain English, Zelensky is accusing Russia of feeding Iran targeting intelligence against American and Gulf assets. That's Ukraine's justification for treating Iranian shipping as a legitimate military target in a war that, on paper, doesn't involve Ukraine at all. So now you have Ukraine saying Iran is functionally at war with it through Russia. And you have Iran saying Israel manufactured the whole incident to drag Ukraine, and by extension NATO, into a second front. 2 governments, 2 completely different explanations for the same 48 hours, and both of them lead to the same outcome. More countries pulled into the same fight, and this didn't happen quietly in a vacuum. It happened on the same day Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sat down with Trump in the Oval Office for their first face-to-face meeting since the two of them launched the war together back in February. Reports out of Washington describe visible friction between them even before the meeting started, over leaked details of what Netanyahu wanted to discuss regarding a fortified underground facility tied to Iran's nuclear program. That's the backdrop. 2 allies who launched a war together, now visibly straining to stay aligned, meeting on the exact day a third country is accusing one of them of secretly widening that war through a fourth country. Let's be precise about what we actually know here versus what's being alleged, because that distinction matters more than usual. What we know. Ukraine struck Iranian-linked vessels in the Caspian. A sailor died. Iran's foreign minister called it unanswerable and accused Israel of orchestration in the same breath. Trump and Netanyahu met in Washington that same week, their first meeting since the war began, specifically to patch over a relationship that has been visibly deteriorating for months. What we don't know, and what nobody has actually proven, is whether Israel had any real role in encouraging or coordinating Ukraine's Caspian operation. There is no leaked memo, no document, no confirmed intelligence assessment showing Israeli involvement. Iran's claim is, right now, an assertion, not a demonstrated fact. But here's why I don't think you should dismiss it just because it's unproven. Watch what an accusation like this accomplishes for Iran, regardless of whether it's true. It does three things simultaneously. First, it reframes an embarrassing loss, a dead sailor, a hit on Iranian shipping, as evidence of a grand conspiracy rather than a simple military failure. Second, it gives Tehran a pretext to treat the Ukraine war and the Iran war as a single unified conflict, which justifies whatever retaliation it chooses next. Third, and this is the part that should worry people in Brussels and Washington more than anyone else, it hands a narrative to every European government already uneasy about this war. A reason to say, see, this is what happens when you let Israel run the show. It drags all of us in. Does that make sense? Iran doesn't need the accusation to be true to get value out of making it. Now let's zoom out, because the headline event is Iran versus Ukraine, but the real story is what's happening to the Western alliance underneath it. For most of this year, Trump's relationship with NATO has been fraying, and a lot of that friction traces directly back to this war. Trump has openly mused about pulling the United States out of the alliance, telling one interviewer earlier this year that he was never swayed by NATO and calling the alliance a paper tiger. At the NATO summit in Turkey earlier this month, allies were nervously watching an announcement out of Washington, a formal review of the American military footprint across Europe. Officials at that summit described it bluntly as a show-me-the-money moment, a signal that continued American commitment to Europe is now conditional on European defense spending, layered directly on top of tension over the Iran campaign itself. So when Araghchi frames the Caspian strike as an Israeli plot to drag Europe into the war, he's not throwing that accusation into a stable alliance. He's throwing it into an alliance that is already cracking over this exact war, at the exact moment its most powerful member is publicly questioning why it's even still a member. That's the strategic logic. If you're Iran and you believe correctly that a fractured NATO is less capable of coordinating pressure against you, then any event that widens the rift between Washington and its European partners works in your favor, whether you engineered it or simply took advantage of it. You don't need to control the outcome. You just need to be the loudest voice explaining it once it happens. And here's where it gets genuinely dangerous. Iran has explicitly said this cannot go unanswered. Not, we are considering an answer, cannot go unanswered. That is a promise of retaliation, and the only open question is against whom and in what form. If Iran retaliates directly against Ukrainian assets or personnel, this war acquires a geographic dimension it has never had before, one that runs straight through Kiev's actual separate war with Russia. If instead, Iran quietly absorbs the loss while continuing to build out its logistics elsewhere, that tells you something different. That Tehran doesn't want a second front open right now, and is choosing to manage the narrative rather than the battlefield. Either way, notice what's already happened in the region while everyone was watching the Caspian headline. Saudi Arabia has been conducting its own strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen after Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping resumed. That's a third and fourth party, Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, now exchanging fire in a conflict that supposedly belongs to just two countries. The war is not staying inside its original borders. It's leaking outward, one theater at a time, and every new theater makes it harder for any single government to say with a straight face that it still controls the shape of this conflict. And underneath all of that sits the Strait of Hormuz, which is really the center of gravity for everything we're talking about. This is not a side issue. Roughly a fifth of the world's crude oil physically passes through that strait. When Iran tried, after the June ceasefire deal, to impose its own approved shipping routes and effectively charge a toll for safe passage, it wasn't just testing American resolve. It was testing whether it could turn a narrow waterway into permanent leverage over the global economy. The multiple tanker incidents in early July and the American strikes that followed were the direct result of that test. So when you now add a second maritime flashpoint in the Caspian, involving a completely different country, you start to see the pattern. Iran, deliberately or not, keeps ending up at the center of exactly the kind of choke point disputes that force outside powers to either escalate or back down publicly. There is rarely a middle option, and that's precisely what makes each of these incidents so combustible. There's also a quieter piece of this that deserves attention every time a new maritime incident happens, whether it's a tanker in the Gulf or a cargo ship in the Caspian. Insurance premiums for shipping through the region tick upward, and some carriers simply choose to reroute rather than pay the risk premium. That's not a headline. It doesn't get a press conference. But it is a slow, compounding cost that shows up months later in consumer prices. And it's part of why people who track the shipping and energy sectors have started describing this less as a war with occasional economic side effects, and more as a standing tax on global trade that nobody voted for and nobody can simply switch off. Because I don't think you should just take my framing at face value. Let me make the strongest case against it. The skeptical rate is this: Iran accuses everyone of orchestrating everything against it. That's not analysis, that's a pattern. Iranian officials have blamed Israel for instigating unrest inside the country. For sabotage? For assassinations? For economic pressure? Calling the Ukraine strike an Israeli plot to drag in NATO may simply be Tehran's default explanatory reflex, not a genuine strategic insight worth taking seriously. And there's a simpler, more boring explanation for the Caspian strike that has nothing to do with Israel at all. Ukraine has spent this entire war expanding the range of what it's willing to hit, refineries, ports, and now shipping lanes thousands of miles from the front line. Zelensky's own justification, that the vessels were carrying military cargo destined for Russia, and that Iranian intelligence sharing is helping Russia target American and Gulf assets, is a self-contained rationale. Ukraine doesn't need Israel's permission or encouragement to decide that a ship supplying its enemy is a legitimate target. Sometimes, the simplest explanation, two wars whose supply chains happen to overlap, is the correct one, and the conspiracy layered on top of it is unnecessary. That's a real argument, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Here's the problem with the boring explanation, though. It doesn't need to be false for the dangerous outcome to still happen. Even if Israel had absolutely nothing to do with Ukraine's decision, the effect on the alliance is identical. European governments watching a war-adjacent state get pulled into direct fire with Iran at the exact moment Washington is threatening to walk away from the continent still experience it as the war spreading. The rift with NATO still widens either way. Iran's accusation doesn't need to be accurate to produce the strategic effect Iran wants. It only needs to be believed by the right audience. And that audience is European publics and parliaments, already exhausted by a war their governments never voted to join in the first place. Let's talk about what's underneath all of this, because none of it is abstract. The financial toll of this war has become large enough that the Pentagon recently reclassified how it counts casualties, moving newer deaths and injuries out of the official Operation Epic Fury tally and into a separate category, because the administration has publicly maintained the operation itself concluded back in May, even as fighting and dying have continued since. A multi-billion-dollar supplemental funding request has been sitting in Congress for weeks without a vote. Oil markets have swung sharply on every new escalation. Refineries on both sides of these overlapping wars have been knocked offline, and ordinary consumers in America, in Europe, in Asia, are the ones absorbing the price at the pump every time one of these fronts flares up. And politically, both leaders sitting in that Oval Office meeting this week have their own clock running. Netanyahu's heading toward an election at home, weakened in part by his own fraying relationship with Trump. Trump is heading into a midterm environment where a war with no defined endpoint and rising costs is not the story any incumbent wants to be telling voters. Neither man walked into that meeting purely to talk military strategy. They walked in needing something to show their own electorates, and that need shapes decisions just as much as anything happening on a battlefield. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it changes how you should read everything else in this story. When two leaders are managing a multi-front war, primarily around their own domestic timelines, an accusation like Iran's doesn't just threaten military cohesion between allies, it becomes a live issue in two separate election cycles at once. An Israeli opposition figure can point to a fraying NATO relationship, as evidence Netanyahu has mismanaged the alliance that Israel depends on. An American critic can point to the same rift as evidence the war has cost more than it delivered. Iran doesn't need to win a single battle to benefit from that. It just needs the war to keep looking expensive and directionless, heading into two different election seasons on two different continents. So here's what I'd put on your radar over the next couple of weeks. First, watch Iran's actual response to the Caspian strike. Rhetoric is cheap. Action tells you what Tehran's real priorities are. If Iran strikes back against Ukrainian interests directly, the war has formally acquired a new front. If Iran stays quiet and simply keeps repeating the accusation against Israel, that tells you Tehran is choosing narrative warfare over kinetic escalation for now, and that's actually the more disciplined move. Second, watch whether European governments start picking up Iran's framing. Watch statements out of Paris, Madrid, and Brussels in particular. If European officials start echoing language about being dragged into someone else's war, that is Iran's strategy working, regardless of what actually happened on that ship in the Caspian. Third, watch the outcome of the American review of troop presence in Europe. If that review results in real reductions, timed anywhere near this latest flashpoint, it will look to a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, like confirmation that Washington's attention and resources are being pulled in a direction NATO allies can't fully see or control. Every empire that gets pulled into a widening war tells itself the same story at first. This is still manageable. This is still the mission we started with. But 5 months in, this war now touches Ukraine's supply lines, Saudi Arabia's air force, the Red Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the internal politics of the NATO alliance itself. None of that was the plan back in February. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Is Iran's accusation against Israel just propaganda designed to fracture an alliance that was already cracking on its own? Or has Tehran correctly identified something that Washington and Brussels haven't fully admitted to themselves yet? that this war stopped being containable months ago, and every new front, whether anyone orchestrated it or not, is simply the shape that a war without an exit strategy eventually takes. I don't have a clean answer, but I think it's the right question. Tell me where you think this framework breaks down. That's how we get closer to actually understanding what's happening here, instead of just watching the headlines scroll by. All right, guys, that's the video for today. Stay curious.